We're back to discuss for the second week the Nobel Prize winner from Nigeria, Wole Soyinka. You can find information about Soyinka in a number of sources, in a number of magazines across the world, but I'd like to focus on what he himself says about African theater in his book, Art, Dialogue, and Outrage, Essays on Literature and Culture. He has one essay in this book entitled The Theater in African Traditional Cultures, Survival Patterns. Those of you who are familiar with the development of the stage in England, with the medieval plays and the mystery plays, will understand the development of theater in Africa the way Wole Soyinka describes it. He tells us that the African theater, the modern African theater, had its origins in the mid-19th century in the Oyo monarchy, where essentially it dealt with the rituals of the burial of the king in the kingdom. And you had what was known as the Ngungan ancestral play, where from the dead where human beings portrayed figures of the dead and attempted to achieve a transition between the dead and the modern players and the citizens or the tribal villagers. There was, in fact, a celebration through guilds and township cults of the Ngungan myths and of the ancestral rites. But the collapse of the Oyo Empire and the disintegration through internal rivalries and other stress put an end to this particular series of dramas, which to some extent resemble the medieval morality plays or mystery plays. The Oyo Empire fell with the attack of the Hausa Fulani in the north and the victories of the Muslims in the south in Yoruba land. Now, when you have an invasion or you have the control of Orthodox Muslims where photographs are forbidden and where absolute pictorial scenes of events are not allowed, then you had a ban upon theatrical performances with masks. There was then a ban upon all types of theatrical genres, bans on the Agbegijo and the Alarinjo, and allied genres characterized by carved masks worn by actors. And these carved masks suggested the dead from the past or had other topological, or symbolic meanings. But the attacks from the north and the Muslim influence from the south banned the drama as we saw it developing in a cult formation through guilds in the 19th century in Africa. The northward drive of Christianity in the 19th century, the large missionary movements, again banned suspect cults, banned dramatic performances, and banned indigenous musical instruments, the bata, the gangan, the dundan. There were, however, in southeast Nigeria, according to Soyinka, male initiation rites utilizing masks, ballet sequences known as the Oje Ogu, and the mimetic. The Okumka and the mimetic moves more toward the types of satire that we're familiar with. Now, of course, when you're looking at Soyinka's The Road, there's a great deal of satire and a good bit of political satire. We'll talk about some of the motifs in The Road, which is the first play we'll discuss tonight in the first 75 minutes. And in the second session, we'll be focusing on Shayinka's adaptation of Euripides' The Bacchae. Now, masks were formed, masks were used in these masked plays, but the action forms the base of the performance. The mask gave you certain symbolic references. These were generally acted by young males because they were initiation rites. The young males would satirize the reluctant bride. And of course, you would have then the initiation rites, the pubic rites, and then move into the marital rites with the reluctant bride. In fact, says Shayinka, there was competition, keen competition among initiates, male initiates, to play the role of the reluctant bride. Shayinka tells us that the various sketches in this vein are rounded off in the end by a masked parade of the various actors in the Nijenji, where the less accomplished actors have their own hour of glory, and the entire female world is satirically lectured on the unkindness of keeping the male rooster waiting too long. There are festivals, and these festivals resemble the Townley plays or the York festivals of medieval drama. The Ogun or Osun River festivals in Yorubaland were the hero. And you also had the hero drama focusing upon the hero Obatala. And in these festivals, meals become feasts, and greetings, normally simple, become ceremonies. Shayinka goes on to tell us that the level of organization involved, the integration of the sublime with the mundane, the endowment of the familiar with properties of the unique, and all this spread over various days, all indicate that it is into the heart of many African festivals that we should look for the most stirring expressions of man's instinct and need for drama, and its most comprehensive and community involving, the events of the community involved. In the Kumna canton in Bobo d'Arlosa in the Upper Volta, you had the return of the village festival. Now, the festivals generally dealt, according to Shayinka, with the history of the people. There were the Mandi traders in the early 16th century. You had the development of the Muslim clerics in the mid-18th century. And you had festivals dealing with the effect of proselytization by 1775. The imamate was established by family scholars. And so from the 16th to the 18th century, you had the advent of festivals in which plays, in which initiation rites were portrayed in dramatic fashion, even up to the advent of colonial and Christian missionaries. There was a festival of the return of the Bobo, says Shayinka, to their village after seasonal migrations. And during these migrations, when you moved either for food or for labor or for work, people died. And so the return to the village meant the commemoration of the death and funeral ceremonies. Costumes are elaborately prepared, says Shayinka. Formal patterns, both of ritual and pageant, worked out and rehearsed in which individual events are enacted by masked figures, and you had a participation by the community as one entity. You had in the African theater an heroic tradition. The theater had epics, sagas, praise chants, ballads, and heroic recitatives in East, Central, and South Africa. One type of festival, one type of dramatic presentation was the pakbuk of the Luo of Kenya and Uganda. This is virtue boasting, which takes place at ceremonial gatherings, usually to the accompaniment of a harp. There was the development of dramatic traditions among the Agimo of southeastern Nigeria with dramatic variants. And what Soyinka is telling us, of course, is a tradition which we can understand in terms of the development of English drama as well. In Central and South Africa, he says, you had non-dramatic developments, however. You had certain rites that were done in traditional worship, but they didn't develop into the kinds of plays that some of these other festivals saw ritual develop. Soyinka tells us that even the dramatic potential of such rituals as the Nasi Iya, the boat building and launching ceremonies of the Luo, with its symbolic cutting of the umbilical cord, as the boat is freed from its moorings, even the abundant parallelisms with nuptial rites, the marriage rites, have somehow failed to move toward a truly dramatic rendering of the significance and life-intertwining role of the boats in the daily preoccupations of the Luo, these people whom he identifies. So while in some parts of Nigeria you had dramatic traditions developing out of initiation rites, out of marital rites, in others where you had very deep symbolism. Imagine the thought of a boat being moored against the shore, and the boat being a child who, when you cut the umbilical cord, then drifts away from the mother. These have intensive dramatic possibilities, but that culture did not develop them, says Soyinka. He says one only need contrast this with the various rites and festivals of the coastal and riverine peoples of West Africa, where both religious observances and economic practicalities of the same activity have taken on, over the centuries, a distinctly dramatic ordering. Here is a man who fully understands dramatic development, dramatic history, and his own dramatic art, which we'll see in its unique fashion. He says that the end of slavery and the decline of slavery enabled the development of the theater in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where slaves returned to set up new nations. And he does talk about the renewal in the style of mystery and miracle plays, in the evolution of the Agimo theater, and the funeral rites of the Oyo court, which are revived. In 1902, he notes the historical play King Agimo of the Egbe Ife Church Dramatic Society, so that while you have attempts and efforts to repress theater, you also have the constant desire of mankind to express itself in theater. And when we talk about theater in the second half and speak about Soyinka's use of classical Greek tragedy, we'll see that the theater becomes a rather impressive way of expressing the tragic nature of life and the tragedy of power. But in Africa, the conflict between the church and the native secularized theater, says Soyinka, always led to times of suppression when the theater was reduced and, in fact, in some cases, even forbidden. Soyinka laments the missionary movement, particularly in the 1920s, that saw the destruction of works of art. He says that in the 1920s, with the cherubim and seraphim movements, these are proselytizing missionary movements to destroy the pagan cultures, so-called pagan cultures, and institute Christian cultures. Soyinka laments the destruction of thousands of works of art from Nigeria, the Cameroons, Ghana, the Ivory Coast. Literally bonfires were created, and these statues of the gods, and these masks, and these drums, and these instruments that were used in these plays were burned. There are aberrations of the theater. The emerging modern theater that Soyinka talks about, more recent, of course, a theater given more license, perhaps in individual countries, in the post-colonial period, with the departure of England, with the departure of France. Soyinka talks about a 1982 theater, the Jaguar Jokers, the Axum Trio, and the Anaskaram Group of Ghana. The Anaskaram Group of Ghana, which deal with a number of separate themes. They deal with the evils of witchcraft, a maladjustment in the social status of the cash crop of the new rich. Excuse me, I've got to go back here for one moment. All right, let's look at this again. You have emerging themes, plays dealing with the evils of witchcraft. The maladjustment in the social status of the cash crop of the nouveau rich, those who have grown wealthy by virtue of investments after colonial rule, and the difference between the classes that have evolved from those who have grown very rich and those who have remained in labor. The modern theater in Africa, Soyinka says, deals with generational problems. How the young adapt to the rituals of the old. How the old adapt to the new faiths after having observed the old faiths. We also have in these plays the changing status of women in society, alterations in sexual mores, and these also become part of the themes of the modern theater. There is also the development of what Soyinka calls pamphlet drama, of the Onitsha market literatures, and people publishing plays and making them available in this sense. One of the playwrights he celebrates, whom we're not going to look at, but whom Soyinka admires, is a playwright by the name of Herbert Ogunde. He says that there are these themes that we've mentioned earlier appear in the plays of Herbert Ogunde, and his chanted dramatic monologue, the Yoruba Ronu, composed while he was under a political ban by the Nigerian government. Ogunde, like Soyinka, finds himself an anathema in the politics and in the oppressive governments that characterized Nigeria. Bread and Hunger by Ogunde dealt with the Eva Valley strike by miners in eastern Nigeria, and they dealt with the general inequity of labor exploitation. The Yoruba Rono is an indictment of the corruption and repression of the government of the western region. Now, what Soyinka is doing, of course, is recognizing that the writer is an independent voice. He's a voice of liberty. He's a voice of freedom. He's a voice of social criticism. And to that extent, the value of the writer becomes inestimable in the minds of world culture, and certainly in the minds of those who oppose any type of censorship. When we move on to the road, you'll find that a number of these motifs do in fact appear. We find that there is the deception of the ministers of the word. Now this is Soyinka's play, The Road, that we're going to talk about, and we're going to have an extensive discussion in a few moments about the major themes of The Road. We understand Soyinka prides himself on his knowledge of theatrical history. He prides himself on the historical evolution of the theater. He objects severely to government censorship. And a lot of these themes may find themselves in The Road as we begin to study it tonight. First, he deals with the deception of the ministers of the word. Who are those who are preaching? What are they preaching? And how do they know that they're expressing the truth? For example, Chief in Town is the symbol of political corruption. He's a unique character. And we know that Soyinka, when he talks about the political corruption in his plays, is referring to Nigerian politics. We discover that there is a breakdown. If there's a breakdown in government, then there's going to be a breakdown in personal ethics and personal actions. And so we discover that there are drivers who buy forged licenses rather than subject themselves to driver's tests. And of course, if the drivers themselves are subject to corruption because they recognize the corruption of the government, then we can imagine every aspect of the government, every aspect of public life, every aspect of business life becomes subject to these corrupt influences. These plays attack organized religion. We find that there is vanity attributed to church followers, and there is the corruption of the church itself by virtue of those who maintain it, those who proselytize for the church, those who gain funding for the church, those who tithe for the church, and those who use church funds for their own purposes and church practices for their own advantage, to their own advantage. We also see in Soyinka's works and in the drama of the period the wastefulness and futility of war. We don't quite find that in The Road, except in the uniforms that people wear, in the abandonment of war, in the discovery that people who no longer fight the war have to find other ventures. And if dishonest in military practice, if subject to wastefulness, if depressed by futility, what advantages can they bring to their civilian life? When we begin to look at the road, we begin to look at some of the characters. Murano, personal servant to the professor. Murano, we think, is dead, but he survives, and he becomes an important figure because deaf and dumb. We're not sure, because surviving from an accident, becoming deaf and dumb, Murano becomes a figure who expresses certain aspects and certain concepts of faith, but who cannot voice them. And only at the end do we see how Murano's accident at the beginning, when he's struck down by an automobile, has its place at the end as Soyinka begins to unify his major plots. Cotonou, the driver lately of No Danger, No Delay, is a unique character. He's a character who empowers himself, takes over the job of selling automobile parts, and we'll hear more about that. Samson is a passenger tout. He looks for customers, and he is a driver's mate to Cotonou. Salubi is a driver trainee. Now, I'm just introducing a few of these characters, but in a few moments you'll have a more elaborate discussion and you'll hear more about them. You may even have a repetition of some of these details, but it's always good to remember who these characters are in the plays. And the professor, the proprietor of the Driver's Haven, formerly a Sunday school teacher, becomes quite important in the play. Chief in town is a politician, and when you hear about the political satire and you identify the political satire, you understand why he is called chief in town. Say Tokyo Kid is a driver and a captain of thugs. Tokyo Kid becomes a rival voice, a challenging voice to the professor at the end of this play. And Tokyo Kid's own demise becomes a unique and terrible event in the hands of the Egungun. And we'll hear more about that as these figures become, first of all, elements of corruption, and then figures of death as they play out the acts of life in Soyinka's drama. Particular Joe is a policeman, and we find out how he earns a living and how he expands his income and enhances his riches in the corruption of the government. Several layabouts, people who are in the action, waiting for their turn to either move into positions vacated by Cotonou, by Samson, by Salubi, perhaps by the professor. Normal people, and then the crowd. There are many ways to look at novels, short stories, plays. Sometimes you look at them as a continuous plot. Sometimes you see plots interwoven into plots. But one way to look at the road is to consider a unique term, and that is a term apologue. It is a series of word plays. And as you move toward these word plays, you get certain images of what the writer is trying to say. So instead of a sustained plot, what you move into is a series of episodes where you begin to study the nature of life, or in the road, of course, the nature of death. The professor is always trying to find the secret of death. And therefore, what I'd like to do in discussing plot is really to consider the concept of the apologue, where you move from one sententious set of statements to another sententious set of statements in which ideas are explored, turned about, twisted about, returned to their place of origin, and then again discussed as points of reflection. If you look at the first discussion of the plot, we realize, of course, at the beginning of the play, we're at a roadside shack near the church. Now, the shack, of course, is where the touts are, these people and their cab drivers, their lorry drivers, who solicit customers and who drive them. And we're near the church. The professor likes to discuss sermons. He likes to read lessons because he is not a minister and therefore cannot state sermons. And it's in the church where he finds himself in conflict with the bishop, which is also part of the religious satire or the religious apologia theme in The Road. The scene begins with Salubi and Samson discussing their roles as touts. And they talk about how they're going to get along and how much money they'd like to make. Samson says, "Sometimes I think, what will I do with all the money if I am a millionaire?" They assume the professor has all kinds of money. Salubi says, "First I will marry 10 wives." "Why 10? I no fit count past 10. I can't count past 10. "Just like you," says Samson, "to waste money on women. Why not? What else can a man do with £1 million? "Me," says Samson, "I will buy all the transport lorries in the country, then make Katonu the head driver." "Katonu? Who be Katoni?" "He get experience from me," says Salubi, and they both joke because Katunu is a lorry driver, and the others are touts. Then they begin to study the professor. How does the professor earn his living? Well, one of the things he does is forge driver's license and forge other documents. We discover that as they talk, they begin to mock authority. Their discussion becomes a discussion of business, a discussion of authority, a discussion of how authority is undermined. And Samson mocks authority. He says, once you go past the riot squad, and once you know how to bribe the riot squad, then you can drive with luxury over to the marina and pick up women. But in 159, the professor comes in, and we discover that he has seen an accident. Now, the professor follows accidents. He's not only concerned about what happens with bodies, he's concerned about what happens to the artifacts of the bodies, to their clothing, to their property, to the wheels of the automobile, to the loot he can confiscate from the wrecked automobiles and the wrecked trucks and the wrecked lorries and turn them over to a shop where he can resell them and make a profit. But the professor comes in and makes a unique statement. He says, 3 souls, you know, fled up the tree. 3 souls killed in an accident fled up the tree. We retrieve the dead, and the souls are upset. The souls are upset that these bodies have forced them out because they chose to stay and they wanted to stay. We find that as we discuss events in the road, as we see events passing by in the road, that the professor likes to read the church lessons, while the bishop's sermons put people to sleep. Again, the sententious episode becomes a satire on religion. On page 167, we get an interesting theme when we talk about the sententious episodes, and that is the disappearance of time. Years ago in the Pléiade, there was a Frenchman who uttered the statement, "Where are the snows of yesteryear? Où sont les neiges d'antan?" Meaning, time passes, and it passes much too quickly. And that theme is expressed by Katuna, where he says, on page 167 in your text, "Where is Zorro, who never returned from the north without a basket of guinea fowl eggs? Where is Akani the lizard? I have not seen any other tout who would stand on the lorry's roof and play the samba at 60 miles an hour. Where is Sigidiopi? Where is Sapala Joe, who took on 6 policemen at the crossing and knocked them all into the river?" He goes on to say, "Where is Indian Charlie, who taught us driving? Well, tried to teach you anyway." And then Soyinka becomes international. He says, "Where is Humphrey Bogart, the Cimarron Kid? Have you known any other driver to take an oil tanker from Mount Harcourt to Kaduna non-stop since Muftal died?" All these stories of the past, they're gone because death has taken these people, and their memories are all that we have left. We have another story, another sententious thought, a study of religion of the period with the story of Tokyo Kid, who delivers timber. And someone says, "What is it to deliver a dead load of timber?" "Dead," says Tokyo Kid. "Dead? You think a guy of timber is a dead load? What you talking, kid? You reckon you can handle a timber lorry like you drive your passenger truck? No, there's something different about driving lumber. You want to sit down and feel that dead load trying to take the steering wheel from your hand. You kidding? There is 100 spirits in every guy of timber trying to do you down because you've trapped them in. See, the spirits cannot get out of these trees. The trees have been cut down. There's no more life, and yet the spirits have been locked inside them. There is a spirit in hell for every guy of timber." You reckon a guy just goes and cuts down a guy of timber? You got to do it proper, man, or you won't live to cut another log. Dead men tell no tales, kid. Until that guy is sawn up, until the lumber is sawn up and turned to a bench or a table, the spirit guy is still struggling inside. And Soyinka gives us insight into the nymphs of the forest, into the spirits of the forest, into the life that inhabits every generative being, every generative substance in nature. And it's this that comes in conflict with Christianity in the old culture and the modern culture. We can move on to discuss other aspects of the sententious nature of these episodes throughout the road. But what we are discovering at each instance of conversation, and the conversation, by the way, is not indifferent and not unlike conversation at a local inn, conversation in a local bar, conversation in an open hut restaurant where people sit around and watch television. These conversations are conversations among men around the circle, around the fire, around benches, expressing thoughts of life and thoughts of death. There is, and it will be discussed at much greater length in our discussion of Part 2, a major accident of a lorry at a large bridge. Apparently, Cthulhu was driving his lorry, and a large lorry passed him, and in passing encountered an accident, had an accident, and numerous bodies were deprived of their spirits, we might say. In fact, we find that when the professor gets there, he discovers all kinds of bodies, bodies of children, bodies of old women, bodies of disenfranchised souls who no longer have a place to reside. And it's the death of the bodies in the large lorry that becomes exploitive for the professor and for others, who then have a great deal of contraband, a great deal of bodies from which they can ultimately profit. Each of these epilogues becomes an important moment in the road. And one of the major concerns is the concern of Cthulhu, who killed Murano in an accident, or thinks he killed Murano in an accident, and then decides as repentant that he must never again drive a lorry. And this is a sacrifice for him and for others who consider him to be a major driver. But someone must pay for these deaths. Now, in a few moments, we're going to have more of a discussion of the road, and you'll hear from Miss Frida King, who is going to address these issues. Thank you.
Dr. Rothman has gone over these, but I will keep it in front of us to refer to. The Agimo, which is the same, they're used together, Agimo and Agimo, as the same meanings. Alagemo. It's the masquerade of spirits in Agimo cult or masquerader wearing of spirit mask. Shoyinka on some occasions uses Agimo and Alagimo interchangeably. The road is symbolic for the path or the way of life for people of Nigeria. This speeding up, this modernization that is occurring rapidly. This road is depicting transition in religion, government, economics, education, and social areas. That's a lot of transitions and a lot of modernization. And we see this chaos in the roads that abound in deaths and the hocuses of the gang and the professor. The road also stands for, symbolically, Ogun's, or mythically, Ogun's terrain of transition. And from life to death is one of the transitions very much on all the pages in the road. As we heard last week, Ogun is a creative, destructive, suffering, vindictive deity. Flesh being the food of Ogun. And we've seen this in the road where Samson asks Kotonu to kill him a dog after, in the bridge major event, because he wants Ogun to spare him on the road. Ogun as a god of the road he is a force for progress, but sometimes this progress leads to devastation. Ogun is a warring duality and represents lessons that is present throughout Soyinka's work. There's a poem in our book, Wole Soyinka Collected Plays, and actually this is not in, I got this in another book, in a reference book. So this one play I will read to you, this one poem, excuse me, I will read to you is not in the play. It's called Ogun Abibamen. I think Abibamen means black man. In time of strife, none vies with him of 7 paths. Ogun, who, to right or wrong, emptied reservoirs of blood in heaven, yet raged with thirst. I read his savage beauty on black brows in depths of molten bronze of flame. That is a poem that Shoyenka authored himself. That quote that I was referring to about kill us a dog before the hungry God lies in wait and makes a substitute of me. That's Samson to Kotonu on page 198 in our text. We also get information in our text before we get into the actual play, just a page or two before, in For the Producer, opposite page of the characters. That is very handy, and my fellow students are anything like me. I did not understand that the first time reading it. Actually, the first time reading it, I took the play quite literally. And the play, as we know, is on many different levels of interpretation. Agimo, again, another meaning, is a mere phase, includes the passage of transition from the human to the divine essence, which relates to the road and Murano, as in the festival of Ogun in this play, as much as the part psychic, part intellectual grope of professor toward the essence of death. As we know, the professor is groping for the word, which he thinks he is going to receive the understanding of death in life. Igungun, to refresh our memories, is the masquerade of the dead, of ancestral spirits. The play has 2 parts. Just a minute. The first part is pretty much the span of the whole day. The second part, part 2 of the play, is consisting of 1 hour, the twilight hour. Part 1 of the play, it starts at dawn, and the whole play spans from dawn to dusk, 1 single day, in 1 main place. Even though in part 1 we do, it's mainly in the present, and there are some topics to the past acted out. In part 2, there's a lot of things in the past that are acted out. The driver's festival accident, the bridge accident, of course the ending communion ritual, where everything seems to come to an end, those last several pages, 4 or 5 pages. The style of The Road is a vibrant African tragic art, and it certainly is that. The rhetorical devices, we see outrageous death scenes, confusing religious explanations about the word, animal imagery, particularly when we first begin reading the play. The animal imagery just caught my eye right away, about Samson and Kotonu and Salubi waking up, stretched. They sleep like cats on benches. I forget who was sleeping on the bench. I think Salubi. Sprawled on the floor. I mean, the rhetoric is very animal-like, or animal-like living, like a cat or a dog would live. And the spider and the spider web are scattered throughout the play. And I take this as a symbol. It has a symbolic meaning in it, which we will get into in a moment. The outrageous images, broken heads, smear of blood, menstrual blood, many lives rush in and out between her legs, most of it waste. The road, like woman, know how to lie in wait. The spider symbol is quite interesting to me. The spider imagery Soyinka uses in the play. And I perceive it to be the road and the spider. Well, this is a quote from the text on page 178. Road and the spider lie gloating. Then the fly buzzes along like a happy fool, on page 178 again. The spider, to me, represents in this reference a destructive power. It could be likened to the road itself, waiting as an element of transition causing death. Like the spider could be looked at as a god, or like Ogun waiting for a fly, or the spider waiting for its victim, such as the road. I think that the spider is foreshadowing death and of all the content throughout the play. Trapped fly is satisfying Ogun again, but we see in the end that Morano becomes entrapped in his body, or this second half of the play, and the professor, Morano and the professor do die, and the spider finally gets its kill at the end of the play, because there's another spider, a significant reference toward the end. I found another interesting symbol that stood out to me, particularly in my theme of death in the spiritual world, is stained glass. The stained glass window. In the opening of the play, the window was closed. The ending scene on page 222 of our text, lights appear through the stained glass window. The stained glass window, to me, represents divine understanding. But what kind of divine understanding? We certainly see that gets closed or misinterpreted, or the professor has his own sense of divine understanding that is chaotic and confusing to many of the gang, like Samson, who gets confused every time or doesn't understand what professor's talking about the road. The professor in the play is really, he's mad. Psychologists of today would have a ball seeking to define and understand his personality, because he's a character of evil sorts. We get a hint to the play's meaning with the road, the center of the site where the road centers around. It's a roadside shack where the gang lives. It has a ragged fence. There's a church on the bend of this road of the setting of the play. So we have a roadside shack, a ragged fence, a church right nearby, right on the same bend, the closed stained glass window. This is all described on the first page as we get our setting. There's this mammy wagon, but it's lopsided and minus its wheels. And this is where the professor houses his spare parts, and it's his store that is so valuable to him and that provides a corrupt means of an income for him and the gang. And the mammy wagon is called Accident Store, all parts available. And we see an education issue in talking about Greece's accident is spelled A-K-S-I-D-E-N-T, and available A-V-A-L-E-B-U-L in the text. We meet Morano leaving on the first page, going for his day of palm wine tapping. On page 186 and 187 of the road, Professor tells us where he found Morano and tells us about him. He tells us he found him neglected in the back of a hearse and dying. The professor brings Morano back to life through necromancy, necromantic, necromantic, necromantic powers used by Professor to nurse Morano to partial life and to restore him, to keep a god captive and to restore him to his former occupation as the palm wine tapper. So the professor has his evil reasons for bringing Morano back to life and not letting him die like the natural process that Morano was going through there, and the mythical process. Morano, in the play, when he is brought back to life through the necromantic powers of Professor, becomes the professor's personal servant. That's a neat trick the professor does. Brings him back to life through magical means, and then he becomes the professor's personal servant. And a palm wine tapper, which is the wine for the evening communion each day, and it's the wine that's used in the ending scene. In a critical article, the bearer of the Egungun mask is Morano. We see, I think it's on page 207 through 209, the account of Cotonou hitting Morano. And in the text, this is a complete break where the past breaks into the present. Now, a critical article explaining Morano and what's going on in this drivers' festival when Morano is wearing the mask, who in the masquerade to celebrate the drivers' festival before the play begins, Morano has also been the mask mount for Ogun, the god of the road. In that ceremonial road, however, he has been run down by a lorry. You see that Morano's been run down by a lorry, and thus his presence upon stage at the conclusion of the play is, as Soyinka says, a dramatic embodiment of the suspension of death. So that's the symbolic meaning of Morano. He's really dead. Since at the time of the accident, he had already entered the Agimo phase of the ceremony. That is the liminal phase of transition from the human to the divine. It is this that enables Morano to function for Soyinka as an arrest of time, and he is a creature in limbo. And of course, Professor really keeps him imprisoned and alive through his hocus pocus. Cotonou is a driver. Professor tells us he's a coast-to-coast driver. But Cotonou is really shaken up when Morano, in those pages of explaining the Drivers' Festival in our text, Cotonou is shaken up. And it's as if Morano wanted to run into his truck, his vehicle. And Samson is also with him. Cotonou, we see, represents the character that feels and has some compassion in the play. And he was one of my favorite characters. I think he also helped, he was one of the characters that had a redeeming quality, or that redeemed the play for some good purpose in life. Samson, Cotonou's mate, driver's mate, is very concerned. He represents the material person concerned about material and money, and there's one reference in the play that Salubi thinks Samson is like a nagging wife, worried over Cotonou. Cotonou is not himself these days, especially after the bridge accident and the Drivers' Festival with hitting Morano with this mask and running into his vehicle. Cotonou is debating whether to work for the professor in his spare parts store, and and Samson's all upset about this, that Cotonou is going to give up his professional dignity to lower himself to run out and scavenge auto parts after automobile accidents from dead people, and then give those parts to Professor so he can sell them in the store. But Cotonou's response to worried Samson is, at least I will see a man's face before I bash it in, and that's page 169. And Cotonou thinks that the spare parts, working for the spare parts store, will be much more peaceful to trade in death than to witness it. As we see, he has witnessed a lot of accidents and deaths. We've seen a couple samplings of them, which I will hopefully explain a little further, if time permits me. Cotonou does give up driving after hitting the unidentified Marano. And Cotonou survives the ordeal, as we see in those pages 207 through 209. He survives it only by hiding the body in the back of his lorry. If you can imagine what Samson and Cotonou must have gone through when they see this person running into their automobile wearing a mask. So they put the dead body in the back of the lorry, and the problem is what to do with the mask, because Marano was wearing the mask in the Drivers' Festival, and this transition from death to life, or from death to the spirit world. So the mask is there. So it's not only the mask, there's a lot of energy around this mask, and it's like gotten out of control, and there's Drivers' Festival participants running around looking for Cotonou and Samson, and they were feared for their lives, as we can see in the text. So in a shocked state, Cotonou drove the body to the accident store. Cotonou maintains the mask, has the mask with him, probably on the front seat, so he drives the body to this is like a mystery story. What do you do with the dead body here? He drives the body to the accident store and leaves it there, thinks it's safe, but the professor steals it. The professor stole it, and no one knows this right now, except, of course, Marano, who he brings back to life. The disgraced lay preacher, professor, who now earns an exploitative living as a wrecker, driver, and he, as Dr. Rothman said, and forges driver's licenses. And we see this. We see Salubi drooling over a driver's license that Professor keeps bringing up to Salubi. I think it's in the second part of the play. But Salubi is an unqualified driver, and that would be putting more unqualified drivers on an already dangerous I would imagine Nigerian road or African road. There is a very interesting account in the, just as an aside, account of the disgraced lay preacher in the text on page 162 through 164. And this really has element of several of the Greases also, the education, the religion, the spiritual economy issues. It's the rivalry between the professor and the bishop when, and there's religious significance to this rivalry also. It's a cute story and funny. I also think the play, which is a saving grace, has much humor in it, scattered throughout it, and I enjoyed that humor element as I was reading it. There was one time when I was reading the play that I had to stop reading it because of the gruesome, all the deaths and all the accidents, because my son was coming over to our home that evening, and I knew he would be driving on the road, and I didn't want all these images of accidents in my mind. Cotonou does not know that he hit Morano. He does not know who Morano, that Morano, the professor's servant, is the one that he hit in the Drivers' Festival. He doesn't know that yet. I want to go back to the account again of the disgraced preacher. We see in there the some Christian rhetoric, and every time the bishop said the name of Jesus Christ, the professor would bow. The bishop wanted to get rid of professor. Evidently there was a power struggle within the church. So they had their run-in together, and I think the bishop won, because after this incident on page 162, I don't see Professor being able to go into the church anymore. Actually, he's disgraced. And there's this question about church funds also with the bishop and the church. So it looks like quite definitely the play is telling us that the professor has stolen church funds too. Yes.
This is a good point for me to move to the English 3345 players. Ms. King has brought you to a rather interesting point, and that is the point at which we understand that the professor is corrupt, that the professor has been banned from the church, that the professor is a charlatan. Now, the play ends with a confrontation between the gangster, say Tokyo Kid, the professor, and the others involved, with Morano putting on the Agungan mask. Now what happens is a series of situations that culminate, of course, in the death of the professor. They culminate in the death of the professor, and it culminates in the death of, say, Tokyo Kid, who kills the professor. But in a series of quick situations, the play comes to a conclusion. It begins with the professor professing, in effect, his spiritual images and impressions of the rainbow. And from that point on, we see things deteriorate to a quick ending. So let's have the players up here, and we'll begin with that.
Who is Party Joe? Not Careful Joe? I don't know. No one move. Are you Patriotic Joe? Patriotic Joe? Yeah, get up here. Yeah, we got stuff for you to do too. Okay. Let no one move.
All right, the professor speaks, and then say Tokyo Kid, and particular Joe, who is the policeman, comes in too. We're going to pick this up.
Professor, you know I'm not superstitious. I mean, in my position I can't afford to be, but this, I swear, sir, I would sooner you forged 100 insurance policies.
I must hope, even now, I cannot yet believe that death's revelation must be total, or not at all.
I reckon this has gone too far. I ain't scared like all these people, so I'm telling you, you're fooling around where you ain't got no business. I'm say Tokyo Kid, and I don't give one damn.
Do you cringe because you are confronted by the final gate to the word? My friends, Morano is dumb, and this creature suffers from gutturals like a love-crazed frog, and yet you let the one sustain your spirits, and the other fill you dead with awe. Play you the croakers play? Or have the blessings of Morano's daily pilgrimage dried already in the hollows of your cheeks? Play and burst your flooded throats before I draw the bowstring of the word, and the veiled shaft bores paths of faith across your cowering mind. Do I feel your whine for nothing? Play, you foul-mouthed vermin of the road.
And at this point, the masked figures, the dancers, are moving about in this play as we see the final scenes in which we see, say, Tokyo Kid attack the professor.
not think my gratitude excessive, but you make me feel that I was back among my Sunday school children. It is a painful thing to desert one's calling. Ask your friend over there who still cannot tear himself from the road. Following in the path of Sergeant Burma is no substitute. He will find that out.
Are you still, Libby? Huh. I don't want no curse in my head.
Let's not annoy him. You know how he is.
Annoy him? Do you want to go blind from the things you shouldn't see? Huh?
We have, after all, to decide many things, as for instance, who next runs our store? The coast-to-coast driver is a little tired, and the regular customers have lost patience.
I ain't afraid. Even if he's master of the spirits of every timber I ever wrestled with, I can teach him a lesson.
It's not in my nature to be trusting. Human beings, even such as you, prove so tenacious, and I have despaired again and again, but I hope you will remember that we formed a syndicate.
I have forgotten all that business, Professor.
So I cannot desert you. I only hope, whoever it is, that you will not balk me, that you will not keep me waiting until I am beyond benefiting from our settlement. One must cheat fear by foreknowledge. I feel powered tonight, but that is usual. I also feel at last a true excitement of the mind and spirit, as if that day has been lowered at last, which I have long awaited. Surely I am not alone. If I am that, then I have wasted evenings of instruction on you. You dregs, you emptied faces, have I shared my thoughts with you for nothing?
Stop it! Stop it! Supposed to hit you, and hit you, and hit you. Who you calling boss anyway? I stopped playing along with this sacrilege.
Play.
This has gone far enough.
You make yourself conspicuous. Sit down. But even like the road itself,
I'm dead now.
flatten your bellies with the hunger of an unpropitious day. Power your hands with the knowledge of death. And in the heat of the afternoon, when the sheen rises false forests and a watered heaven, let the event first unravel before your eyes. Or in the dust when ghost lorries pass you by, and your shouts, your tears, fall on death panels, and the dust swallows them. Dip in the same basin as the man that makes his last journey, and stir with one finger, wobbling reflections of two hands, but only one face. Breathe like the road, be the road. Coil yourself in dreams, lay flat in treachery and deceit, and at the moment of a trusting step, rear your head and strike the traveler in his confidence. Swallow him whole or break him on the earth. Spread a broad sheet for death, with the length and the time of the sun between you, until the one face multiplies and the one shadow is cast by all the doomed. Breathe like the road, be even like the road itself.
And the professor ends the scene with a final sermon, discovering that he has not learned the lesson of death, except when Say Tokyo Kid stabs him and leads him to his death. The Agungan mask picks up Say Tokyo Kid and throws him against the wall where he dies. And so you have the death of the charlatan, the death of the criminal, others coming up to take their place. The entire action of the road becomes an almost mythological recreation of life's puzzles and the answers of death that one discovers only in death and no other way. When we begin to discuss the next play, we'll talk for a few moments about some of the language patterns in the road that make it somewhat difficult to read, but make it a tour de force in the hands of an artist like Wole Soyinka. Thank you.